The restaurant was filled with soft golden light, shining off the crystal chandeliers that hung from the ceiling. The tables were dressed with crisp white cloths, sparkling glassware, and polished silverware. It was one of those nights when the hotel's dining hall seemed more like a palace than a restaurant. Guests in elegant gowns and tailored suits were chatting in low tones, laughing softly, and clinking their glasses together. The air was full of expectation, not just for the food, but for the music that would accompany the evening. Music in this restaurant was always a highlight, a reason many guests returned again and again. In the midst of all this, a young waitress moved quietly between the tables, balancing a tray of drinks. She had worked here for almost a year, but tonight felt different. She noticed how carefully every detail mattered. The folded napkins, the polished cutlery, the way the waiters smiled politely but didn't laugh too loudly. She had learned to move through the dining hall almost invisibly, not disturbing anyone, always ready with a polite word or a gentle nod. Her life outside the restaurant was simple. She didn't have luxury, but she had dreams, and those dreams were carried in her mind and in the music she loved more than anything. Since she was a child, the piano had been her world. She couldn't afford lessons, and her family had never understood her love for music. Still, she practiced whenever she could, on an old, out-of-tune piano at home, pressing the keys softly, imagining herself on a grand stage, the lights bright and the audience captivated by every note she played. Music gave her something the world outside her small apartment could not: freedom. In her mind, she was no longer a waitress, no longer carrying trays and wiping tables. She was a musician, a storyteller with every finger movement. She often hummed melodies as she worked in the restaurant. Guests sometimes noticed her soft humming, but most thought it was just a quiet sound someone made when lost in thought. No one suspected that behind that gentle, polite demeanor was someone who could make music soar. But tonight, the thought of music was different. It wasn't just in her mind. It was something real that could happen in front of people who had money, influence, and the power to change her life forever. As she moved through the tables, balancing trays and taking orders, she noticed the orchestra stage at the corner of the hall. Normally, a trained pianist would be there, rehearsing quietly, making sure every note was perfect for the evening. But tonight there was silence. A small commotion had happened earlier, and the usual pianist had called in sick at the last minute. The manager looked worried, pacing near the stage, muttering to himself about replacements. A live pianist was supposed to begin in a few minutes, and the elite crowd would notice immediately if something went wrong. The young waitress paused for a moment, balancing a tray of sparkling water in her hand, and her eyes flicked toward the piano. It was a grand instrument, polished to perfection, the black and white keys gleaming under the soft light. She felt a flutter in her stomach. It was an impossible thought, of course. A waitress stepping up to play in front of an audience like this? The idea was terrifying. But at the same time, the piano seemed to call to her, as if it had been waiting for her all along. She returned to her duties, but her mind stayed on the piano. She watched the manager talking to another staff member, trying to find anyone who could play. The restaurant's guests were beginning to notice the delay. Conversations paused for a moment, heads turned toward the stage, and a few guests whispered among themselves. The music had always been part of the experience, and now the absence of sound was like a missing piece in a puzzle. The young waitress continued moving through the hall, serving drinks, refilling glasses, and smiling politely. No one would have guessed the storm of thoughts behind her calm face. She thought about how many times she had imagined herself in a moment like this. How many evenings had she spent at home, her fingers dancing across worn keys, imagining applause and standing ovations. Yet, the idea of stepping into the spotlight in front of real people, not her quiet room, made her stomach tighten. A colleague, noticing her lingering near the stage, whispered, "Maybe you should play. You do love music, right?" The words were soft, almost teasing, but they planted a tiny seed. The young waitress shook her head slightly. It wasn't that simple. These guests were used to perfection. They were used to trained musicians, not a waitress who practiced on an old piano at home. She moved back to the tables, taking another order, and as she did, she felt something shift inside her. It wasn't just about playing music anymore. It was about daring to take a chance. Years of practice, of dreaming, of imagining herself at a piano had led to this moment. And maybe, just maybe, the universe was giving her an opening she couldn't ignore. The manager finally noticed her lingering near the piano and shook his head, muttering to himself. He was still too frantic to consider her seriously. No one had suggested it. She was just a waitress. But the young waitress felt a quiet determination growing inside her. Music was her voice, her power, and if she let fear control her, she would always wonder what could have been. She stepped a little closer to the piano, her heart pounding. The hall was buzzing with conversations, silverware clinking, the soft hum of expectation. She imagined sitting on the polished bench, hands hovering over the keys, the first note trembling into existence. The thought both thrilled and terrified her. Could she do it? Could she really step into this world of elite guests and play a melody that would silence them, that would make them listen? Her fingers brushed the keys gently, almost hesitantly, feeling the cold smoothness of the ivory beneath them. The sound was familiar, comforting, and it gave her courage. She could do this. She had done it 1,000 times in her small apartment, alone in the quiet. Tonight, it was just the next step, the moment when practice became reality. The young waitress returned to her tasks, but she could feel eyes on her. Not everyone noticed, but some did, sensing the tension and anticipation building around the stage. Whispers began to float through the room. Where is the pianist? Who will play? This is a high-profile event. The crowd expected perfection, and she felt the weight of that expectation pressing down on her shoulders. Still, she knew something important. Music was not about approval. It was about expression. It was about courage. And if she let fear win, she would never know the power of her own gift. She glanced at the grand piano one more time, then back at the tables. She could hear the soft murmurs of guests, the quiet panic of the staff, the polite but impatient tapping of fingers on glass rims. Everything was ready for music except the music itself. In that moment she made a choice. She would not let this chance pass her by. She would step forward even if it terrified her. Even if the elite crowd had never imagined a waitress could play in their midst. She would trust her hands, her fingers, and the music that had carried her through so many lonely nights. And so, as she carried another tray of drinks past the stage, she felt the smallest spark of excitement. This was her chance, the moment she had dreamed of for years. The grand piano waited, the keys gleaming, as if inviting her to play. She could almost hear the first note in her mind, soft and trembling, ready to bloom into something magnificent. All she had to do was take the first step. The young waitress continued her work, moving gracefully between the tables, smiling and taking orders, but her mind was no longer just on the tasks at hand. Every step she took brought her closer to the piano, and the thought of it made her heart race. The restaurant was buzzing more than usual. The absence of music had created a strange tension. The guests were starting to notice, exchanging whispers and glances toward the empty stage. Some looked slightly impatient, while others simply seemed curious about what might happen next. The young waitress felt every eye that flicked in her direction, though most had no idea she would be the one to fill that silence. She had learned over the years how to move quietly through a crowd, to serve without being noticed, and to listen without being interrupted. But now, every movement seemed louder in her ears. The soft clinking of silverware and the gentle hum of conversation sounded like a drumbeat urging her forward. She carried a tray of drinks toward a table, her fingers gripping the edge tightly, as if to steady not just the glasses, but her own nerves. A colleague approached quietly, leaning in just enough to speak without drawing attention. "You should really think about playing," they said in a low voice. There was no pressure, only encouragement. "You love music. You've practiced for years. Maybe now is the time." The young waitress forced a small smile and nodded. It wasn't the first time someone had suggested it, but tonight felt different. The idea that she could actually step onto the stage, that the elite crowd could hear her, made her chest tighten. Fear mixed with excitement in a way she had never felt before. But the thought lingered, growing stronger with each passing moment. She moved to a table near the stage, placing a glass of sparkling water down carefully. Her eyes flicked toward the piano again. It seemed to gleam under the warm light, almost as if it knew someone special was approaching. She imagined her fingers moving over the keys, each note forming a sentence in a story only she could tell. Music had always been her escape, her way of communicating when words felt too heavy or too simple. And tonight, it might be her way of reaching people who had never seen her beyond the apron she wore. The manager was still pacing near the stage, wringing his hands and speaking to another staff member. He looked stressed, and the young waitress could see the worry lines etched on his face. The audience was beginning to murmur more noticeably, some glancing at watches, others exchanging looks of curiosity. The absence of a pianist was becoming more obvious, and the pressure in the room was growing. It was the kind of pressure that could freeze someone in place, or, if embraced, could ignite something extraordinary. The waitress took a deep breath and whispered to herself, almost like a secret chant, "I can do this." Her hands shook slightly, but the thought of playing, of letting her music fill the room, pushed the fear away just enough to take action. She imagined the first note, soft and trembling, breaking the silence. It was a thought that gave her courage, a tiny spark that became brighter with every step toward the stage. She moved behind a table, pretending to adjust a glass, while keeping her gaze fixed on the piano. The elite guests were talking quietly among themselves, some noticing the commotion with curiosity, others simply waiting for something to happen. There was no applause yet, only anticipation. She knew that once she played, everything would change. She felt a strange mix of dread and exhilaration. She could hear the quiet heartbeat of the room, the anticipation, and it synchronized with the rhythm in her chest. Finally, she left the tray behind, walking slowly toward the piano. Every step was deliberate, each one carrying the weight of years of practice and dreams. She could feel the eyes of the staff and a few curious guests following her, sensing something unusual was about to happen. Some guests whispered among themselves, puzzled by her approach. A young couple exchanged looks, trying to understand why a waitress would dare to step onto the stage. The moment felt suspended in time, the hum of conversation fading into silence as all attention gravitated toward the grand piano. She reached the bench and hesitated for a moment. Her fingers hovered over the keys, and she felt a chill run through her body. The grand piano was cold beneath her hands, the keys smooth and perfect, unlike the worn instrument she practiced on at home. Yet, the familiarity of the notes brought her comfort. Music had always been a part of her, and now it was waiting for her to release it into the world. She glanced at the crowd, and their faces reflected a mix of curiosity, skepticism, and quiet expectation. It was intimidating, but she remembered why she loved music. It was not about impressing anyone. It was about speaking from the heart, about letting her fingers tell a story that words could not capture. She could do this. She had done it 1,000 times in her apartment, alone and unseen. Now it was simply a matter of sharing it with others. Taking another deep breath, she sat down on the bench, feeling the polished wood beneath her. Her hands rested lightly on the keys, and for a moment, she simply listened to the soft whispers in the room, the subtle clinking of glasses, the quiet rustle of napkins. The noise felt distant, like it belonged to another world. She was ready. She had imagined this moment countless times, and now it was here. She pressed a single note. It was soft, almost timid, yet it rang clearly through the hall. The sound made a few guests pause mid-conversation, turning their heads toward the source. It was not a grand entrance, but it was the beginning, the first step of a story waiting to unfold. She took a moment, letting the sound fill her ears and the room, feeling the vibrations travel through her fingertips and into her heart. The second note followed, more confident than the first. Her hands moved carefully, but with a growing sense of certainty. The audience began to notice, some leaning forward slightly, intrigued by the music coming from an unexpected source. The waitress's fingers began to dance across the keys, producing a melody that was gentle, yet powerful, delicate, yet full of emotion. She was telling a story through each note, revealing a part of herself she had kept hidden for so long. The room grew quiet. Conversations faded completely as guests turned their attention to the piano. Some were skeptical, still unsure if this could be good, but others were captivated by the purity of the music. The waitress's initial fear melted away, replaced by a sense of freedom and joy. She had imagined herself here for years, and now, finally, it was real. The melody flowed naturally, as if her fingers were translating the thoughts and emotions she had held inside for so long. Her eyes closed briefly as she played, feeling the music in every part of her body. She was no longer just a waitress in an elite restaurant. She was a musician, a storyteller, a person sharing her soul through sound. Every guest was listening, some with disbelief, others with awe. It was as if the music had a life of its own, commanding attention and respect. The young waitress smiled softly, realizing that courage and passion could break through fear and expectation. She continued to play, the melody growing richer and more expressive with every note. The crowd's reaction began to shift. Skepticism turned to admiration. Some guests whispered to each other, unable to contain their amazement. The young waitress felt a deep connection with everyone listening, sensing that her music was touching hearts and changing the mood of the room. She was no longer just filling a silence. She was creating an experience, something unforgettable. Minutes passed, though they felt like seconds. The young waitress was completely absorbed in the music, letting it guide her fingers and her spirit. The elite crowd, used to perfection and grandeur, was now captivated by authenticity and passion. They had expected entertainment, but they were witnessing something far more genuine. Raw talent, courage, and the human story behind the music. When she finally slowed and ended the piece, the room remained silent for a moment, as if the audience could not believe what they had just heard. Then, slowly, the first claps started. They grew, louder and louder, filling the hall with admiration and praise. The young waitress opened her eyes, blinking in surprise at the enthusiastic response. Faces that had seemed indifferent or skeptical were now full of awe and respect. The manager, who had been pacing nervously, stopped in his tracks, his jaw dropping slightly. The staff looked at each other in disbelief. The young waitress, still seated at the piano, felt a mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. She had done it. She had taken a chance, faced her fear, and shared her gift. And in doing so, she had captured the hearts of everyone in the room. It was a moment that would stay with her forever. A night when courage and music transformed her life and the perception of everyone around her. The young waitress felt a rush of energy as she continued to play. Each note she struck seemed to grow bolder, filling the large dining hall with sound that was both soft and commanding. She had expected nerves to take over, but instead, a strange calm washed over her. Her fingers moved as if guided by their own memory, flowing from one key to another with ease and confidence. She had imagined this moment countless times in the quiet of her small apartment, but now, surrounded by the gleaming chandeliers and polished tables, it felt far more real and alive than she could have ever imagined. Guests who had been murmuring in curiosity a moment before were now completely silent. Some leaned forward in their chairs, hands clasped, eyes fixed on the piano. Others rested their elbows lightly on the table, chins cupped in their hands, completely absorbed in the music. The transformation in the room was astonishing. What had begun as a quiet, polite expectation had become intense attention. People who had been preoccupied with their meals and conversation were now focused solely on the young waitress and the music she produced. The young waitress felt a thrill in her chest. Each note told a story of years spent practicing alone, of dreaming beyond her small apartment, of longing for a moment like this. She had never thought she would play in front of an audience like this, but now that she was here, she could not stop. Music had become a bridge between her inner world and the reality surrounding her. It was a language everyone understood, regardless of wealth, status, or background. Her hands moved faster now, not recklessly, but with precision and emotion. The melody she created was delicate, yet powerful. She mixed soft, lingering notes with faster, more vibrant ones, telling a story that was both personal and universal. There was fear in the quiet moments, hope in the gentle swells, and joy in the rising tempo. The crowd felt it all, though none could articulate why it touched them so deeply. It was not just skill they were witnessing. It was authenticity, the raw essence of someone daring to share their heart. As she played, she noticed the subtle expressions on the faces of the guests. Some had tears forming at the corners of their eyes, moved by the unexpected beauty of the music. Others sat with mouths slightly open, clearly astonished. She even noticed a few guests exchanging glances, nodding subtly at each other, as if to confirm that what they were hearing was real. The music she played had broken through their elite veneer, piercing directly into something human, something they had perhaps forgotten in their world of refinement and status. The young waitress had never felt such a sense of connection. She felt as though the room and everyone in it had vanished except for her and the piano. She was aware of her surroundings, yet completely immersed in the music. The keys beneath her fingers seemed to respond to her emotions, producing tones that carried exactly what she felt inside. She realized that this was the essence of music, not to perform perfectly, but to express truthfully. A few guests attempted to whisper to each other, but even they quickly fell silent as the melody swept through the hall. The chatter faded into a distant hum, replaced by the sound of each note resonating in the space. The young waitress noticed that some people had tears in their eyes, and it struck her deeply. She had always played for herself, for the joy it gave her alone. But now, she was playing for them, for the people in that room who were experiencing something unexpected, something real and moving. It was a new kind of fulfillment, one she had never anticipated. The manager, who had been tense and uncertain just minutes ago, now watched in awe. His hands were clasped behind his back, eyes wide, unable to hide the pride and surprise that filled him. The other staff members, who had been skeptical or simply carrying on with their duties, had stopped to watch as well. There was a collective recognition that something extraordinary was happening. The young waitress, someone they had always seen in the background, had stepped into the spotlight and was commanding it with grace and talent. She continued to play, her fingers moving effortlessly, but with a delicacy that held every listener's attention. There was a rhythm to the melody that was both soothing and exhilarating. It spoke of struggle, of dreams deferred, and of hope realized. Every guest, no matter how accustomed to luxury or elite gatherings, could feel the story embedded in the music. It was as though the piano itself had become a storyteller, and she was the voice translating the notes into something tangible and moving. The young waitress paused for a brief moment, letting a long, soft note linger in the air. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of attention, of expectation, and of wonder. The guests held their breath, savoring the sound and the feeling it carried. She looked around, noticing the subtle nods and widened eyes, and felt a rush of validation, not in ego, but in knowing that her music had reached them. It was a silent acknowledgement that her years of practice, her courage, and her passion had not been in vain. With a deep breath, she continued, her hands flowing over the keys with renewed energy. The melody built gradually, rising and falling like a gentle wave. It was dynamic yet balanced, expressive yet controlled. She felt her emotions pour into the music, her fears dissolving with each note. The audience could sense it too. The room was no longer filled with just an elite crowd. It was filled with human hearts responding to an honest and beautiful performance. The young waitress noticed subtle movements in the audience. Some guests were swaying slightly to the rhythm, others had their eyes closed, absorbing every sound. She felt a sense of unity, a rare and magical connection between performer and listener. For a moment, it didn't matter that she was a waitress and they were wealthy and influential. In this space, music had leveled everything, and everyone was simply human, feeling the beauty and emotion she was sharing. She began to introduce more complex passages, the melody intertwining in ways that showed both technical skill and emotional depth. Each chord, each transition, seemed to capture something personal yet universal. The guests were spellbound. Their disbelief had vanished completely, replaced by admiration and awe. Some whispered quietly to each other, unable to comprehend that this level of talent had come from someone they had assumed was just a waitress. The realization added to the magic of the moment. The young waitress felt a quiet joy welling inside her. She had always loved music, but she had never experienced the feeling of playing for others who truly listened, who responded not with polite applause, but with genuine attention and emotional engagement. It was intoxicating, and it gave her strength to continue, to explore the limits of her own ability and expression. She played a series of notes that were both rapid and precise, her fingers moving with a speed that made the melody dance in the air. The room responded immediately. Some guests leaned closer, as if trying to catch every nuance, every subtle variation. Others sat back, letting the music wash over them, their expressions softening and their bodies relaxing. She had transformed the atmosphere of the entire hall. The dining room that had once felt formal and stiff was now alive with the vibrations of her music, echoing off the walls and filling every corner with emotion. As she reached the climax of the piece, the melody soared, vibrant and full of life. Her fingers flew over the keys, confident and expressive, yet never losing the emotional undertone that made the music resonate with every listener. The young waitress felt as if she were floating above the piano, her spirit intertwined with the notes she created. The crowd, in turn, was drawn into that experience, feeling the highs and lows, the tension and release, the beauty of something unexpected and extraordinary. When the final note rang out, the room held its breath for a heartbeat before erupting into applause. The sound was thunderous, filling the hall and bouncing off the walls. Guests rose to their feet, clapping, cheering, and some even whistling in delight. The young waitress opened her eyes, blinking in surprise and awe at the reaction. She had not just played a song. She had captured hearts, defied expectations, and created a moment that would be remembered by everyone present. Tears welled in the eyes of some guests, moved by the unexpected beauty of the performance. Others smiled widely, amazed that such talent could emerge from someone they had underestimated. The manager and staff watched, equally astonished, realizing that the young waitress had turned a potentially awkward and tense situation into a triumph of talent and courage. It was a turning point, not just for the night, but for the young waitress herself. She had stepped forward, faced her fears, and in doing so, had revealed a side of herself that the world had never seen. The applause continued, echoing through the grand dining hall, and the young waitress felt a deep sense of fulfillment. She had not only played a beautiful piece of music, she had shared a part of herself, her passion, and her story. And in that moment, she knew that this was only the beginning of a journey that could change her life forever. The crowd could not believe their ears, and she could not believe the courage that had brought her here, to this stage, to this moment, where music and heart met in perfect harmony. The young waitress felt a sense of wonder as the last notes lingered in the air. The applause continued, more enthusiastic than she had imagined. It was a sound that felt almost surreal, a mixture of joy, admiration, and disbelief. Her hands rested on the piano keys, trembling slightly from adrenaline, but her heart felt light. She had taken the risk, stepped into the spotlight, and for a few minutes, she had become something more than just a waitress. She had become a musician, a storyteller, a person who could touch hearts with her talent. The audience was slowly settling back into their seats, but their energy had changed. Conversations started again, but now they were filled with excitement and wonder. Guests whispered to each other, sharing their astonishment, exchanging glances as if confirming that they had just witnessed something extraordinary. The young waitress noticed how the room had shifted. It was no longer a formal dining hall with a polished routine. It had become a place alive with shared emotion and connection. She took a deep breath and looked around. The manager, still stunned, had a proud smile on his face. Other staff members were beaming, unable to hide their amazement. It was clear that everyone realized how extraordinary the performance had been. What had started as a routine night at the restaurant had turned into a defining moment, not just for the guests, but for everyone who had been part of it. The young waitress felt a quiet sense of accomplishment, knowing she had exceeded even her own expectations. As she continued to play softly, improvising a few gentle notes, some guests began to approach the piano. They were smiling, clapping lightly, and expressing their admiration. One elderly man, who had been quietly observing from a corner, approached with a look of deep appreciation. "You have a gift," he said, his voice filled with sincerity. "I have never heard anything like that before. You have a talent that must be shared with the world." The young waitress felt her cheeks warm. Compliments like this were rare, and hearing them from someone she respected made her heart swell. Other guests followed, offering praise and encouragement. Some asked how long she had been playing, while others simply shook their heads in disbelief that someone they had underestimated could create such beautiful music. The young waitress listened quietly, feeling a mixture of pride and humility. She had never played for attention or recognition, only for the joy it brought her. But now, seeing the impact of her music on others, she understood the power it had to connect people, to inspire, and to transform a moment into something unforgettable. As the evening progressed, she continued to play, letting her fingers explore the piano with a gentle confidence. Each note carried emotion, telling a story of courage, hope, and determination. The guests listened intently, captivated by the sincerity and depth of her performance. She noticed how even the most reserved individuals were affected, their expressions softening, eyes glistening, and smiles appearing as the music spoke to them in ways words never could. It was a magical moment, one that transcended the boundaries of social status and expectation. The young waitress felt a growing sense of freedom as she played. She realized that music was not just about technique or perfection. It was about expression and connection. She had spent years practicing alone, imagining herself in moments like this, and now she was living the dream she had always nurtured. The piano had become an extension of herself, a way to communicate emotions that had no other outlet. The audience could feel it, and that made every note she played more meaningful. A young couple approached, clapping softly, their eyes wide with admiration. "We couldn't believe it when we saw you sitting at the piano," they said. "But the moment you played, it was impossible to look away. You have a rare gift." The young waitress smiled, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. She had never sought fame or recognition, but moments like this reminded her why she loved music. It was about creating an experience, touching hearts, and leaving a lasting impression that could not be measured in applause or accolades. The room was now filled with a different energy. The elite guests, who had arrived expecting a simple performance, were now captivated by something far more authentic and profound. They had witnessed courage and talent in its purest form, and it had left them speechless. The young waitress felt a deep connection with everyone present, as if the music had created a shared space where social boundaries no longer mattered. For a brief time, everyone in the room was united by the beauty of sound, the power of emotion, and the authenticity of a person daring to step forward. As the night went on, the young waitress continued to play, exploring new melodies and harmonies. She experimented with tempo and dynamics, allowing the music to flow naturally from her emotions. Each chord, each pause, each rise and fall of the melody carried meaning, telling a story that resonated with the listeners. She noticed how even the most skeptical guests were now engaged, leaning in to catch every nuance, appreciating the depth and sincerity of her performance. The applause that followed each piece of music was warm and heartfelt. Guests approached her, offering compliments and encouragement, their expressions filled with genuine admiration. Some asked if she had formal training, while others simply shook their heads in amazement. The young waitress responded with quiet gratitude, feeling a mixture of humility and pride. She had never imagined that her music could have such an impact, and the realization was both humbling and exhilarating. Throughout the evening, she continued to play, allowing the piano to become an extension of her emotions. She thought about the years of practice, the moments of doubt, and the quiet determination that had brought her to this stage. Each note was a reflection of her journey, a testament to perseverance, passion, and courage. The guests could feel it, and that made the experience even more meaningful. The young waitress noticed how the music had transformed the atmosphere of the dining hall. What had begun as a formal, elegant space had become a living, breathing environment, full of emotion and connection. Guests were no longer just observers. They were participants, experiencing the story she was telling through sound. The music had broken down barriers, created a sense of unity, and reminded everyone of the power of art to touch hearts. As the evening drew to a close, the young waitress played a final, gentle melody, allowing the notes to linger in the air. The guests listened in silence, savoring the beauty of the moment. When the last note faded, the room erupted in applause once again, louder and more enthusiastic than before. The young waitress smiled, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment and gratitude. She had stepped forward, faced her fears, and shared her gift with the world. In doing so, she had created a moment that would be remembered by everyone present. A night when music, courage, and authenticity had come together to create something truly extraordinary. The young waitress had barely taken a breath since her performance began, yet the energy in the room gave her strength she had never felt before. The applause had settled into an almost reverent silence, as though everyone was still absorbing the beauty of what they had just experienced. Some guests whispered to each other, unable to believe the talent they had witnessed. Others simply stared at her in awe, smiling softly, their expressions a mixture of amazement and newfound respect. The elite crowd, usually accustomed to polished professionals and rehearsed performances, had just been swept away by something raw, emotional, and real. A music producer, sitting at a table near the back, had been quietly observing since the beginning. He had seen countless performers in his life, some technically flawless but emotionally empty. Yet here was a young woman, a waitress by day, captivating an audience without a hint of pretension or showmanship. He could feel her passion through the music, could sense the story behind every note, and it stirred something in him that he rarely experienced. He leaned forward, noting her technique, her control, and, most importantly, the honesty in her performance. This was not a performance for approval, it was an offering of her heart. Guests began to approach the piano, still clapping softly, offering words of encouragement. One elderly woman, her eyes glistening with tears, said, "I have never heard anything so beautiful. You have a gift that cannot be hidden. Please promise me you will continue to play for the world." The young waitress felt her cheeks warm with the compliment, and a sense of humility mixed with pride. She had never played for recognition, but moments like this reminded her of the power music had to connect people, to touch hearts, and to inspire change. The manager, once so tense and worried, now stood with his hands clasped in awe. He had seen her in the restaurant countless times, serving tables quietly, unnoticed by most. Yet here she was, transforming a moment of potential disaster into an unforgettable experience. He could not hide the pride that filled him. Even the staff, who had been skeptical and unsure, now looked at her with admiration. She had taken a risk, embraced her courage, and revealed a talent that was undeniable. A small group of guests, including several well-known figures from the music industry, approached her. They asked about her background, how she had learned to play, and whether she had formal training. She explained quietly, with humility, that she had practiced for years on her own, driven by love for the piano and the joy it brought her. Their reactions were a mixture of astonishment and admiration. The fact that someone could achieve such skill without formal training made her story even more compelling. The music producer made his way toward her, a smile of genuine excitement on his face. "You have something extraordinary," he said. "I have been searching for talent like yours for years. Have you ever considered pursuing music professionally?" The young waitress felt a mix of surprise, disbelief, and cautious hope. She had dreamed of a life in music, but she had never imagined it could be within reach, let alone presented so unexpectedly. The idea of stepping into a professional world filled her with both excitement and nervousness. Yet, the thought of sharing her music with a larger audience, of making it her life's path, was exhilarating. As she played a few more gentle notes for the guests lingering around the piano, she felt the warmth and encouragement from the crowd. Their smiles and admiration were contagious. Every chord she played seemed to communicate more than words ever could. She could see the connection in their eyes, the way they leaned in to listen, the subtle nods of approval and recognition. She realized that music was not just a personal expression. It was a bridge between hearts, a language that needed no translation. The room seemed to breathe with her music. The atmosphere, once formal and elegant, had transformed into something intimate and alive. Guests were no longer simply observers. They were participants, moved by the story she was telling through her fingers. Even those who initially doubted her ability could no longer resist the power of her performance. It was as if the music had created a shared experience, dissolving social barriers and reminding everyone present of the beauty of raw, human talent. As the evening progressed, she played with a sense of freedom she had never known. The melodies flowed naturally, shifting from soft and delicate to powerful and expressive. Each note carried her emotion, her dreams, and her courage. She could feel the audience responding, their energy feeding into her own. It was a feedback loop of emotion and artistry, creating a moment that was both unforgettable and transformative. She realized that this was the essence of music. Not perfection, but connection, honesty, and the courage to share one's heart. Several guests approached her afterward, offering invitations and opportunities. One guest, a renowned event organizer, suggested that she perform at larger venues, introducing her to influential figures in the music world. Another offered to help her connect with professional teachers who could further refine her talent. Each suggestion and opportunity filled her with hope and gratitude. She had never imagined that a single performance could open so many doors. Yet here she was, standing at the beginning of a new chapter in her life. The music producer lingered, his eyes sparkling with excitement. "I want to help you share your talent with the world," he said. "There is something special about your music, a truth and emotion that people respond to immediately. With the right guidance, you could have a career that reaches far beyond this restaurant." The young waitress listened carefully, feeling a mix of anticipation and nervousness. She knew that stepping into a professional world would be challenging, but the possibilities were undeniable. Her music, which had once been a private escape, could now become a force that touched countless lives. She paused for a moment, reflecting on the journey that had led her here. From practicing in solitude, dreaming of stages and applause, to standing before an elite audience who could not believe their ears. The journey had been long and uncertain, but every challenge, every moment of doubt, had prepared her for this opportunity. She felt gratitude for the small moments, the quiet determination, and the love of music that had never left her side. As the night wound down, guests continued to approach her, expressing admiration and curiosity. She answered questions patiently, shared her story with humility, and accepted praise with quiet grace. The impact of her performance extended beyond the music. It was a testament to perseverance, courage, and the power of following one's passion. The elite crowd, accustomed to polish and performance, had witnessed authenticity and emotion, and it left them transformed in a subtle, unforgettable way. The young waitress reflected on the significance of this evening. It was more than just a successful performance. It was a turning point, a moment where dreams intersected with reality. She had taken a leap of faith, faced her fears, and discovered that courage could open doors she had never imagined. Music had given her a voice, a way to connect with others, and an opportunity to transform her life. She felt a deep sense of fulfillment, knowing that her talent had been recognized and appreciated by those who mattered. The manager approached her, his expression a mix of pride and amazement. "I have never seen anything like that," he said. "You turned what could have been a disaster into the highlight of the evening. Everyone is talking about you." The young waitress smiled softly, feeling a sense of accomplishment that went beyond the applause. She had proven to herself and to others that talent, courage, and passion could create extraordinary moments, regardless of status or expectation. As the night ended and the guests departed, she lingered near the piano, her fingers lightly touching the keys. The music had not only captured the audience but had changed her own perspective. She realized that her journey was just beginning. The opportunities presented to her were a chance to continue sharing her music, to grow, and to inspire others as she had been inspired. The piano, once a symbol of dreams deferred, had become a gateway to a future full of possibility and hope. She knew that her life was about to change in ways she could not yet imagine. The performance had revealed her potential, opened doors to new experiences, and connected her with people who could guide and support her. But more importantly, it had reaffirmed her love for music, her dedication to her craft, and the importance of courage and authenticity. She had faced the unknown, embraced her talent, and created a moment that would be remembered by everyone in the room. And as she looked at the piano one last time that night, she knew that this was only the beginning of a remarkable journey, one where music, passion, and determination would continue to shape her life and the lives of those who heard her play. The next morning, the young waitress woke up with a mixture of excitement and nervous energy. Last night's performance still felt surreal in her mind. She replayed every moment. The first note, the audience's surprise, the applause, and the unexpected recognition from people she never imagined would notice her. It was a night that had changed everything, yet she still felt grounded, remembering the long hours of practice that had brought her here. She knew that the journey ahead would be filled with challenges, but for the first time, she felt ready to embrace them. When she arrived at work, the atmosphere was different. Her colleagues greeted her with smiles and admiration. The news of her performance had spread quickly, and even those who had been skeptical were now inspired. The manager approached, a proud look on his face, and said, "I hope you know how many people you impressed last night. This could be the start of something extraordinary for you." She nodded, feeling a warm sense of validation. It wasn't just about recognition. It was about realizing that her dedication, passion, and courage had tangible results. Throughout the day, guests from the previous night approached, expressing their admiration and sharing how deeply they had been touched by her music. Some offered connections, invitations, and opportunities she had never considered. A renowned music teacher requested a meeting to discuss her potential, while others encouraged her to perform at larger venues. Each conversation filled her with hope and excitement, but also a quiet sense of responsibility. She understood that this was no longer just a hobby. It was a calling that demanded commitment, growth, and perseverance. As the day went on, she reflected on the journey that had led her here. Music had always been her refuge, a way to express emotions she could not put into words. From quiet evenings in her small apartment to late-night practice sessions, she had poured her heart into every note. And now the world was finally noticing. The realization that her passion could create real impact was both empowering and humbling. The young waitress decided to dedicate herself fully to music, balancing her responsibilities at work with her newfound opportunities. She spent hours at the piano each day, refining her technique, exploring new compositions, and experimenting with different styles. Each session was a discovery, revealing new aspects of her talent and deepening her connection with music. She also began writing her own pieces, drawing inspiration from personal experiences, emotions, and the stories she wanted to share with the world. As she immersed herself in her music, she noticed subtle changes in herself. She became more confident, expressive, and courageous, both on and off the stage. The fear that had once held her back slowly transformed into determination and resilience. She understood that talent alone was not enough. Discipline, dedication, and the willingness to embrace challenges were equally important. And with each day, she grew stronger, ready to face the opportunities and obstacles that lay ahead. Word of her talent continued to spread. Invitations to perform at local events, private gatherings, and music festivals began to arrive. She felt a mixture of excitement and nerves at the prospect of performing for new audiences. But she also understood that these experiences would help her grow, both as a musician and as a person. Each performance was a chance to connect, inspire, and share a piece of her heart through music. One evening, she was invited to play at a prestigious music event, surrounded by professional musicians and industry figures. It was a chance to step further into the world she had always dreamed of. As she prepared, she felt the familiar mixture of fear and excitement, but she also felt a quiet confidence. She knew that her music had power, that her dedication had prepared her for this moment, and that her passion would guide her through. The performance was a resounding success. The audience was captivated, moved by the authenticity and emotion in her music. She received standing ovations, heartfelt compliments, and even offers for collaboration. It was clear that her talent was not a fleeting moment. It was something that could reach far beyond her initial audience. And as she left the stage that night, she felt a deep sense of purpose and fulfillment, knowing that she was on the path she had always dreamed of. Over time, she began to receive recognition not just for her talent, but for her story. She became an inspiration to others, a reminder that courage, passion, and perseverance could overcome doubt and expectation. Young musicians, especially those from humble backgrounds, looked up to her as an example of what could be achieved with dedication and belief in oneself. She embraced this role with humility, always remembering the long nights of practice, the quiet moments of doubt, and the joy of playing purely for love of music. As her career developed, she continued to balance her personal life with her growing musical responsibilities. She remained grounded, keeping close relationships with friends, family, and colleagues who had supported her from the beginning. She also made time to teach and mentor aspiring musicians, sharing her knowledge, experiences, and the lessons she had learned about courage, resilience, and the power of following one's passion. Her music evolved over the years, reflecting the experiences she had lived, the people she had met, and the emotions she had felt. She explored different genres, composed original pieces, and collaborated with other musicians to create performances that were both innovative and deeply moving. Each note she played was infused with emotion, connecting with audiences on a profound level and leaving lasting impressions. Her talent was undeniable, but it was her authenticity, courage, and dedication that made her music truly remarkable. The young waitress, once unnoticed in a busy restaurant, had become a celebrated musician, admired not only for her technical skill, but for her ability to touch hearts and inspire others. She had taken a chance, faced her fears, and allowed her passion to guide her. In doing so, she transformed her life and created a legacy of music, courage, and authenticity. Her journey was a testament to the power of following one's dreams, embracing challenges, and sharing one's gifts with the world. As she reflected on her journey, she often thought back to that first performance, the night when she had stepped up to the piano and astonished an elite crowd. It had been the turning point, the moment when her life shifted forever. She realized that talent alone was not enough. It was courage, determination, and authenticity that had allowed her to seize the opportunity and shine. And as she continued to play, inspire, and create, she knew that her journey was far from over. The world of music was vast, full of possibilities, and she was ready to explore it with passion, heart, and unwavering dedication. Years later, when she looked back on that pivotal night, she remembered the fear, the excitement, and the overwhelming sense of possibility. She remembered the applause, the astonishment, and the way her music had touched people in ways words could not. But most importantly, she remembered the courage it took to step forward, to believe in herself, and to share her gift. That courage had changed her life, opened doors, and allowed her to become the musician and the person she was always meant to be. The young waitress had started with a simple love for music, a passion nurtured in solitude and driven by dreams. Through perseverance, courage, and dedication, she had transformed that passion into a life-changing journey. She had proven that with belief in oneself, the willingness to take risks, and the heart to share one's gifts, extraordinary things could happen. And as she continued to play, inspire, and connect with others through her music, she knew that the possibilities were endless, and that the world could always be surprised by the courage and talent of those willing to step